All right. So like imagine you're in charge,
Yeah.
right? And you've got to make these big decisions about where to put your resources.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always about like straight up dollars and cents.
Right.
Especially, let's say you're running a power company. I mean, how do you compare, the risk of a major power outage
Yeah.
with, say, the need to improve safety measures to protect, the public or your own workers? It's like, how do you even begin to...
Yeah. How do you measure those two things against each other? It's tough.
It's a tough one. It's like comparing apples and oranges. Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Absolutely.
This whole idea of how you grapple with those kinds of really tricky comparisons when it comes to risk.
Yeah.
And we've got some fascinating material to dig into. We've got excerpts from a text that lays out this method called the multi-attribute value approach.
MEA.
MAVA.
Right.
And we've got this super interesting YouTube video from ManageX Value. They're showing how this actually plays out in the power and utility sector, which is perfect for our analogy here. So we're going to be looking at reliability, safety, financial implications, the whole 9 yards.
It's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about power and utilities, those are organizations where the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
When the lights go out, it's not just an inconvenience. It can have, really serious consequences
Oh, absolutely.
for people's lives and businesses. And of course, there's always that pressure to keep costs under control.
Right.
So how do they balance all of that? I think that's what's really interesting for our listeners today, to sort of peek behind the curtain and see how these organizations are making those decisions.
Exactly. Like, what's the thinking? What's the framework they're using to navigate this really complex landscape?
Mm-hmm.
So let's paint a picture for everybody listening, okay?
Okay.
You've got these potential problems. Some are going to hit the company's bottom line directly, financial losses.
Right.
But then you've got others that might disrupt the service that, people rely on.
Right.
Or even have these huge public safety implications.
Yeah.
So how do you even begin to weigh those different things when you're trying to decide, okay, where are we going to put our effort? Where are we going to invest?
Well, it's where traditional financial analysis, kind of breaks down a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it's really good at comparing things when you're just talking about dollars and cents.
Yeah.
But when you start to factor in these other elements, like, okay, what's the cost of a power outage to, a community?
Right.
Or what's the cost of a safety incident? It's not so straightforward to put a dollar figure on those things.
Absolutely. So that's where this MAV, this multi-attribute value approach comes in.
Exactly.
So can you break that down for us? Like, what's the basic idea behind it?
So at its core, what MAV tries to do is create a way to compare these different types of impacts. So reliability, safety, financial, in a way that makes sense, kind of like apples to apples. Because, if you're just looking at them in isolation, it's really hard to say, okay, is this reliability risk more or less important than this financial risk?
Yeah.
But Avia provides a framework to bring those together and compare them in a meaningful way.
So it's about finding that common ground.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does it actually do that? Does it have like a magic formula?
Well, there's a process involved, but it's not magic.
Okay.
The text we were looking at highlighted that a key element is understanding how much weight the people making the decision, management, are willing to give to each of these areas.
Right.
Like, how much are they willing to trade off in one area to gain in another?
Interesting.
And so by understanding those trade-offs, you can start to put, value on these non-financial impacts. And sometimes, if that's what the organization wants, even translate them into monetary terms.
So essentially they're saying, okay, we're willing to invest X amount to prevent, Y amount of service disruption, or we see Z number of safety incidents as being equivalent to like a financial loss of, W dollars.
Yeah, it's like putting those implicit values that everybody has
Right.
into a more explicit form.
Making them concrete.
Exactly. And so by doing that, you can start to see the full impact of a risk event.
Okay.
Not just, the immediate financial hit, but also the translated value of those less tangible consequences.
No, I think this is a really important point for our listeners,
Yeah,
because what if an organization's just not comfortable putting a dollar figure on something, a serious injury?
Right.
Or, God forbid, a loss of life. I mean, that feels like it crosses a line for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, and it's a very real concern. And so in those cases, where putting a direct monetary value just feels, wrong, MIVA does offer another option.
Yeah.
And that's the use of what they call a synthetic score.
A synthetic score. Okay, so how is that different from, trying to put a dollar value on everything?
So instead of converting everything into dollars, a synthetic score basically creates a single score that represents the total impact.
Yeah.
It takes all the different impacts, including the financial ones, and translates them all into this single abstract score. It's like creating your own, unit of measurement that's not tied to any specific currency.
So instead of saying this risk has a total impact of like $5 million,
Right.
you might say it has a total impact of, 1,200 points on this made-up scale.
Exactly. And both approaches, whether you're using monetary aggregation or synthetic scores, they both aim to capture that total impact. It's just a different way of expressing it.
Right, different language.
Exactly.
Now, there was something really interesting in that Manage X Value video that I think is so important for anyone listening who's trying to understand all this.
Yeah.
They made this point that MXV doesn't just focus on the risk events themselves, it focuses on the impact of those events.
Right, the consequences.
The consequences, right. So why is that distinction so important?
Well, because one event can have, multiple different types of impacts.
Yeah.
And you need to understand all of them. Like they gave this example of, a severe storm that knocks down power lines.
Right.
So that's one event, but it has multiple impacts.
Yeah.
You've got the immediate impact on customer service because, people are losing power.
Yeah.
You've got the impact on reliability metrics because, the system's not performing as it should.
Right.
But then let's say you have a different event, like a failure in safety protocols at a plant.
Mm-hmm.
So that has an obvious impact on health and safety, right?
Of course.
But it could also lead to service disruptions down the line.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe they have to shut down part of the plant for repairs.
Yeah.
And it can damage the company's reputation.
Right.
So you see how one trigger can have these ripple effects across different areas.
So it's like you're tracing those consequences.
Exactly.
And that gives you a much more complete picture of the real scope of the problem.
Absolutely.
So speaking of those different areas of impact, the video talked specifically about some of the key non-financial ones that are top of mind in the power and utility sector. What were those again?
So for the folks at home, the big ones they highlighted were reliability, so making sure the power is flowing to homes and businesses.
Yeah.
And then health and safety, which includes both employee safety and public safety.
Of course, yeah.
And they even referenced some past incidents where, there were serious public health and safety consequences, which really drives home why this is so important for them.
Absolutely. And they also touched on some less obvious but still really important non-financial impacts, like, loss of customer trust. If people lose faith in the power company, that's a problem, right?
Big problem.
Even if there isn't an immediate financial hit.
Right.
And then just a decline in, the overall service experience. Yeah.
Exactly. And those things can affect the long-term health of a utility.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they don't show up on the balance sheet right away.
So we're starting to see how MXV helps to kind of get a grip on all these different types of impact.
Mm-hmm.
But for our listeners who are thinking, okay, this is all very interesting, but how does this actually play out in the real world? How does this help these organizations make decisions about, where to invest their money, where to make improvements?
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, exactly.
And the text that we looked at really emphasized this key advantage of translating all of these impacts into monetary terms.
Right.
It allows you to do a straightforward ROI analysis.
ROI.
Return on investment.
Okay.
For different investment options. So if you could put a dollar value on the reduction in safety risks that you would get by investing in new equipment,
Yeah.
then you can directly compare that to the cost of the equipment itself.
Oh, I see. So it's like it gives you a common language to work with.
Exactly. And it makes it much easier to justify those investments, especially, when you have to go to, higher ups or stakeholders and say, hey, this is why we need to spend this money.
Like you're making the case.
Exactly. And it's not just about, reducing costs. It's about, improving safety or reliability.
So give us an example. Like, how would this actually work in practice?
Okay, so let's say you have two investment options. One is to upgrade your cybersecurity systems.
Right.
Because you're worried about, potential attacks that could disrupt your operations or steal data.
Right.
And then the other option is to invest in new safety training for your employees to reduce the risk of injuries.
So one's a technology investment and one's a people investment.
Exactly. And so using MXV, you can take that, that reduction in injury risk from the safety training and translate it into a monetary equivalent.
Got it.
And then you can compare the potential ROI of both investments.
Using the same language, yeah.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, the video did bring up that whole debate about using monetary values versus those synthetic scores.
Right. It's a tricky one.
Yeah. So what's the key takeaway there for our listeners?
Well, I think the speaker in the video made a good point, which is that, there are valid ethical concerns about putting a price tag on certain things, like human life.
Yeah.
So for internal risk analysis, when you're just trying to figure out which risks are the most significant, using synthetic scores can be a perfectly fine approach.
Right.
In fact, the video showed how their platform uses these scores to rank different risks based on their overall impact.
So internally, for prioritization, it works. But when it comes to making those investment decisions,
That's where it gets a little trickier.
or does it fall short?
Well, the problem is that when you need to decide whether to actually spend money on something,
Mm-hmm.
you need to be able to compare the cost of that investment to the benefit you're going to get.
Right.
And if you're using a synthetic score to represent the benefit, you can't directly compare that to, the actual dollar cost of the investment.
You're back to apples and oranges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those traditional metrics like ROI or excess value probability, they don't work when you're comparing an abstract score to a dollar amount.
Because at the end of the day, those financial decisions, that's the language everyone understands.
Exactly. Dollars and cents.
Especially the people who control the budget. Right.
Absolutely. And so the speaker in the video argued that, while those ethical considerations are important,
Mm-hmm.
ultimately being able to measure the overall impact in monetary terms gives you a much more robust way to make those investment decisions.
Yeah.
And it also makes it much easier to justify those decisions, especially in industries like power and utilities, which are heavily regulated.
Oh, of course.
They often have to go before regulatory bodies and explain why they're spending money on certain things.
Like rate cases.
Exactly. Rate cases. And so being able to say, look, this investment of X dollars is going to mitigate a risk that could potentially cost us Y dollars.
Yeah.
That's a powerful argument.
It's much more persuasive. Okay, so if our listeners take away one key point from all of this, what should it be?
I think the big takeaway is this. Whether you're using monetary values or synthetic scores, the goal of MAVA is to get a comprehensive view of the total impact of a risk.
Okay.
Not just the financial impact, but all the other consequences as well.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. But when it comes time to actually decide where to put your resources,
Yeah.
being able to translate those non-financial impacts into a dollar value gives you a huge advantage in terms of, prioritizing investments and justifying those decisions.
So it's a powerful tool, especially for these organizations that are dealing with these, these really complex, high-stakes decisions.
Absolutely.
So to sum up our deep dive today,
MAVA, this multi-attribute value approach, gives these organizations, especially in these critical sectors like power and utilities, a way to move beyond just looking at the balance sheet when they're assessing risk.
Right.
By incorporating these non-financial impacts like reliability, safety, public perception, they can make much more informed and ultimately more defensible decisions about where to invest.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the true cost of risk goes far beyond just the dollars and cents.
And finding a way to account for those wider consequences in a systematic way.
Exactly.
So this really gets you thinking, doesn't it? Like in your own life, are there areas where you're kind of making these trade-offs between things that are hard to compare?
Yeah.
Maybe you're choosing between, a higher paying job that has a really long commute,
Right.
or a job that you enjoy more but pays less. Or maybe you're deciding between, buying a product that's really convenient but has a big environmental footprint versus something that's, more sustainable but maybe a little less convenient.
Right.
In those situations, could taking a more structured approach to assigning some kind of value to those different factors, even if it is just in your head, could that help you make those decisions with more clarity?
It's worth considering, right? Just recognizing those trade-offs that we make every day.
Absolutely. And if this whole topic of risk management and MAVA has, piqued your interest, we encourage you to, go out and do some more exploring. There's this whole field called multi-criteria decision analysis that's dedicated to tackling these kinds of evaluations. You might be surprised at what you learn and how it can even apply to your own life.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was a good one.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.